and I'm going to introduce our speakers. So, and as a reminder, I know also, sorry, I should just acknowledge that I have two fabulous staff who are our electric vehicle leads in Massachusetts joining today. So I'm giving a little more background because we have new people. Thanks to Scott Siegel and Katie Weber for joining us today. So with that, we do record the speaker part of these meetings so that anybody who was not able to be at the working group could benefit from the presentations. So thank you to our fabulous speakers. We have Elizabeth Turnbull from the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. Elizabeth is the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. I know they go by ATE. She has over a decade of experience in transportation electrification and utility program work, dating back to 2010 when she first caught the EV bug. She has led transportation electrification programs, regulatory engagement, and the transportation electrification portfolio development at PG&E and Portland General Electric, as well as at third-party program implementer Franklin Energy. She lives in Portland, Oregon. We'll next hear from Mike Zimmerman of the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF. Mike is the interim director and senior attorney of the Clean Affordable Power at the Environmental Defense Fund. Prior to joining EDF, he worked as in-house regulatory counsel, and he supported, among other things, the development and deployment of several vehicle electrification programs. He served as a utility consumer advocate with the New York State Utility Intervention Unit. Mike grew up in Vermont and presently lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then we'll hear from the RMI team. So we have Ben Shapiro and Gerard Westhoff. So Ben Shapiro is a principal with RMI's carbon-free transportation team, which catalyzes rapid progress on emissions reductions and in the transportation sector. Prior to joining RMI, Ben worked at the consulting firm Energy and Environmental Economics, E3, focusing primarily on economic and policy analysis of distributed energy resources and transportation electrification, retail rate design, and avoided cost development. At E3, he catered to a broad range of clients, including energy regulatory agencies, public and private electric utilities, community choice aggregators, battery storage developers, national laboratories, and NGOs. And then we have Gerard, who is a senior associate in the carbon-free transportation team, working on analysis and research to accelerate transportation electrification with a particular focus on trucking and its associated infrastructure. Prior to joining RMI, Gerard was an analyst in the UK government's Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. During his time there, he worked on the evidence base to support the setting of the UK's net zero target and sixth carbon budget, using whole systems modeling of the UK energy system. He also worked on developing industrial decarbonization policies. So we have fabulous speakers. We really appreciate your time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Turnbull.
Well, thank you so much, Commissioner Rubin, and congrats on your new role as chair for this working group. We at ATE have really appreciated the leadership that Commissioner Paratek and Commissioner Dumet have offered, and I know you'll carry that forward. This group is really important. All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Turnbull. As was mentioned, I am the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, or ATE. We can go to the next slide. For those of you who don't know us, ATE is a trade association of electric utilities and automakers, charging companies, and others who are all working toward an electric future for transportation. One of our areas of focus and conversation is on the energization process. And among our members, we foster discussion and sharing and analysis on that topic. And that includes both the electric utilities and the charging companies who are their customers. So it's a very good, robust conversation between those two parties within our working groups. We can go to the next slide. I just wanted to share a little bit about our thought leadership in the past that has really spanned both this interconnection or energization process, rate design, and utility program design. Our latest publication, which I think will be enhanced if you advance the slide, is this paper on focusing on flexible service connections and other new approaches to distribution capacity constraints. And that's the fourth in a series all about energizing EV charging stations. And I think these slides will probably be circulated just so you know, each of these little icons is a hyperlink, so you can follow those to find out more about our research. We can go to the next slide. So to center our conversation today, I wanted to share just this is very high level, a very high level diagram of the typical utility service connection process. And I should note here that after this point, everything that I say is applicable both to EV charging and to other load connections, both the challenges and the solutions. We think there's a particular role to play here for EV charging because it's a particularly acute use case and a particularly flexible type of load. But all of this can be applied to any type of customer. So we start the typical process with a service application from the customer, which goes to an engineering review by the utility. And if you advance the slide, then we're examining this key question here of, is capacity available at this site? And if it is, then we build a service extension and we're on our way to the site being energized. If it is not, then we have to do distribution capacity upgrades. And that might be a feeder or a substation. And if you advance the slide, it will show you that this is really where the process starts to incur higher costs and lengthier timelines. And let's talk on the next slide about those lengthy timelines. So there are sort of these two reasons, or there's at least one reason that impacts energization timelines. And in some cases, again, if you need distribution capacity upgrades, then there are sort of two components to this. They both impact timelines. The first on the right is the service extension. And this is just very straightforward. This is just connecting the load to the grid. But as we know, and we've seen in the media around the NEVI program, and I think we all have heard stories that this is these timelines can extend up to 2 years. And this is where things like transformer availability or personnel bandwidth at the utility or permitting timelines, those types of things start to come into play. And we've covered a lot of those delays in our prior white papers, and there are many solutions. I think it's fair to say we haven't entirely solved this issue yet, but we're going to set all of those things aside for today, and we're really going to focus on when there's a distribution system capacity upgrade need. And that's really about preparing the grid to serve the load. These delays can be caused by a need for an upgraded substation or feeder. And this is where timelines start to lengthen into the many years, and the costs really start to mount. And so these solutions, flexible service connections, is embedded in this bridge to wire solution bullet down in the bottom. And that's where these solutions really start to come into play. We can go to the next slide. And I wanted to talk through as well some of the risks of energization timeline delays, because they can create a challenging narrative, and they also have very real risks for the utility and the customer and policymakers. For the utility, you're disappointing a customer. And you're risking that customer might leave your service territory, build elsewhere, or choose a different technology and end up locked into, a diesel solution, for example, instead of going with an electric truck for a fleet. For the customer, there's higher uncertainty and complexity, and there are also real costs associated with these longer energization timelines. Our friends over at Atlas Public Policy recently calculated these in a report that they released just a couple of weeks ago. These are real costs, especially given the slim profit margins that are available today in EV charging. These are the types of numbers that can break a project's economics. And lastly, for policymakers, there's a missed opportunity for this downward rate pressure that we know that this additional load can bring, impacts to economic development, impacts to state energy policy goals. So we really want to solve these energization timeline issues, and flexible service connections, again, for the right types of timeline delays, can be the right solution. So we can go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into all of these solutions today, but I did want to just share that our report, which we recently released, has a lot more content on all of these categories. The first category is decision support systems, and this is just sort of tools to help the utility and the customer find and better use existing distribution capacity, right? Can we use hosting capacity maps? Can we use fleet advisory services? Can we use capacity checks and other types of approaches so that that we know where the capacity is on the grid and can use what's there? The second category is bridge to wire solutions, and this is where flexible service connections really come in. And this is using the existing capacity flexibly while we build the longer term capacity. And then lastly, long-term load flexibility. This is pretty cutting edge. It's not yet really offered in the United States, but under the bridge to wires solutions, you're still building the long-term capacity. And so you're still incurring those costs. And so quite reasonably, many people are asking the question, what if we just made this flexible forever? And didn't build the longer term capacity. And so I think there are probably places on the grid where that may be possible. I don't think we can obviate the need for building any additional capacity. I think we still have to do that. But many people are asking the question of whether this might be possible in a long-term way to obviate the need for building at least some of that capacity. So I'm going to dig a bit deeper into the bridge to wires because that's where we see the flexible service connections coming in. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So I want to focus on phased, static, and dynamic. So phased service connections are sort of where the connection size increases stepwise over time, right? And the customer builds out their infrastructure in tandem with that. This site, which is owned by Greenlane, which is an ATE member, it's in Colton, California, is a terrific example of this. Greenlane does public charging for medium and heavy duty fleets. Currently, this is a 4 megawatt site because that's what was available. Soon, it's going to be a 12 megawatt site. So Greenlane was able to open this site within 9 months, which is pretty accelerated for the level of construction that this type of site provides. And they were willing to take what the municipal utility had available today, and the municipal utility is sort of building the longer term infrastructure. So that was a real win-win for both the utility and the customer there. Static flexible service connections are where the capacity limits are going to change over time within a specified sort of temporary window. Those capacity limits might vary by day or by season or by both. Typically, we're looking at between 2 and 6 different capacity limits that are applied within that temporary period. So it's pretty straightforward for the customer to operate within those limits. Those are implemented today at Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison, both in California. At PG&E, this is in the form of what's called a load limit letter, where they say, you can't have all the capacity you asked for, but here's what you can have and the times that you can have it. SCE has a load control management system pilot, which is actually closed to new customers, but is continuing with its existing customers. I know that you've heard about that pilot before in these meetings. And a recent decision by the CPUC is going to require PG&E and SCE to work together to create a more standardized tariffed static flexible service connection offer. So more to come in that area as that process unfolds for static. And then dynamic flexible service connections, and again, I know you heard about this last year from PG&E, are more sophisticated and granular. This is where the utility is using a grid DERMS to communicate more granular capacity limits to the customer. These might be hourly, day ahead. Um, the customer has to have enough equipment on the site to receive and apply that signal. And that can be expensive. And the utility, at least as far as most people believe, has to have a grid DERMS to send that signal. And so there's investment on both sides that needs to take place in order for this to work. But for some customers, that additional capacity that they gain can be worth those implementation costs. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk quickly through some of the limitations of bridge to wires, right? Because they're really useful and they can't solve all our problems. And so I think that it's important to keep both of those things in mind. Bridge to wire solutions are temporary. So again, we're not avoiding the long-term grid upgrade costs. They don't impact the service extension timelines, right? So even if you do a flexible service connection, if you're waiting on a service level transformer, you're still waiting on a service level transformer. There's an implementation learning curve for utilities, and I think it's not an accident that these have happened first in California, where the utilities and the state have been investing for a long time in R&D on load flexibility and grid management. Currently, bridge to wire solutions have sort of some limited scalability. Both PG&E and SCE only offer their static flexible service connection to a single customer on a constrained asset. So there's sort of a limit to how many X factors they can incorporate into their grid planning and still keep the grid up and running. And then for dynamic flexible service connections, those are going to require a utility DERMS platform. And so that's a sort of costly investment. And there are lots of other reasons to have a utility DERMS, but not all utilities are going to be in a position to offer those near term. So lastly, we've got a couple of recommendations, and I'll go through the ones for commissions here. First and foremost, we're really recommending that commissions proactively address the question of flexible service connections. Ask the question of, are there distribution grid constraints in the state? Are there lengthy energization timelines due to those grid upgrade needs? If so, this may be an area to explore. We also recommend an accelerated process because where these lengthy energization timelines exist, they are impacting customers today and they're slowing the pace of electrification and they're raising the costs of it. And there's also an opportunity to be flexible, as we saw with PG&E. Sometimes these solutions don't require a regulatory process at all. They can be implemented, just directly in communication with the customer. So we think that utilities can move forward with pretty basic solutions today, and that offers can become more standardized or tariffed over time. And that's what we've seen happen in California. Support utility R&D. I think, again, back to this implementation learning curve, there are a lot of utilities that have a long way to go in terms of learning about how this would work and how it could be implemented within their system. I don't want to get too deep into cost allocation and recovery because that really has more to do with this implemented as a long-term solution, but those questions do come into play. Data and learnings right now are pretty scarce. So we're looking to California to provide more information, and we would recommend, for commissions as they explore this with utilities to create some structure for data and reporting. And then lastly, cost effectiveness. There are implementation costs, and those need to be balanced with the benefits that these approaches bring. So that's all I have for today. There's much more in our paper, and I'm happy to stay on for questions or follow up on any details. And my email address is here. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. Really appreciate it.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was excellent, really helpful overview, and you covered a lot of content in a short period of time. We're going to go to the next presentation, so if you don't mind holding, because I expect we'll have some Q&A for you at the end of all of the presentations. Thank you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike Zimmerman. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, thank you, Commissioner Rubin. And thanks to the working group for having me today. I Mike Zimmerman, interim director at senior attorney on EDF's Clean Affordable Power team. That team applies science, economics, and law to advocate for clean energy solutions that support energy affordability. So I'll be I have a few slides. I'll be making references to a white paper that EDF published last year on flexible service connections. Off the bat, I have to acknowledge my colleagues, Cole Germain and Casey Horan, who have really been taking the laboring oars on that white paper and on our comments in various commissions on the topic. But they could not be available today, so you get me instead. Thank you very much for having me. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you work at a utility regulator, you've heard the common refrain that all utilities are unique, and they're each unique in many different ways, right? So rather than try to argue for a narrow set of specific solutions, I'm I'm going to be discussing some basic categories of considerations that can inform tailoring of flexible service connections to utilities context. Right? Elizabeth described the problem statement, right? Why flexible service connections are important and some of the things that they can do, and cited some examples, which are very useful mileposts, um, uh, uh, but need not and should not be sort of the full extent of the ways that they could be considered, conceived or implemented. Um, I will note here that a lot of the sort of this discussion is on load, as Elizabeth also pointed out. There's a lot of work being done on the generation side too, with respect to flexible connections, connected managed, that sort of thing. In Colorado, in National Grid, in New York with National Grid's flexible service connection pilot, load will frequently be able to piggyback on those efforts as well. That's sort of a recurring theme here, I think we're seeing. But again, these remarks are specifically focused on load. Next slide, please. So in the white paper, we identify three dimensions of considerations or axes of considerations that utilities and regulators can think about when starting to develop a flexible service connection regime. Number one, and each of these, will vary, or the answers to each of these, where you land on each of these axes, will vary based on the utility specific context and their customers' needs. So number one, how often will the customer's load limit change, right? It can be, on the least complex side, static, right? Set one level and it stays that way permanently or until the flexible service connection ends, all the way up to real-time limits. Each step to the right unlocks additional incremental capacity for the customer and additional revenues for the utility, in exchange for more complexity and cost, right? So the incremental benefit, of each step to the right has an incremental cost associated with it. Of the examples that Elizabeth was talking about, many of the load limit letters that you see in PG&Es are static load limits. We also see static load limits on the generation side, for example, in Encore, in Texas. The California PUC recently issued an order just last month, directing PG&E and SCE to develop flexible service connection programs that use seasonal load limits. So it's one more step to the right. PG&E also offers day-ahead limits as part of its FlexConnect program, as Elizabeth mentioned. Next slide, please. Choice number two, communication method. How will the utility exchange information with the customer related to the customer's load limit? This axis tracks closely with the prior one. Basically, the more frequent the customer's load limit will change, the more frequent and detailed the communications between the customer and the utility are going to need to be. But they can start at pretty low tech. So autonomous communications on the left side refers to where where regular communications, real time, are not required between the customer and the utility. For example, Southern California's Edison's LCMS pilot, load control management system pilot, where the customer's settings are set at the outside of the program and then left in place. The utility gets information on the customer's performance through meter data. And if the customer is failing to perform, the utility can reach out to that customer through phone, email, other mechanisms. Next, click to the right, decentralized management refers to devices that can manage the customer's load without requiring real-time or continuous control from the utility's mothership, from a centralized data processor. So there's a couple of different versions of this. My home state of Pennsylvania, there's a company called Camus that's talking with a couple of utilities here to deploy a device that sits on the constrained asset of a given circuit and interfaces directly with the customer's load control management system. When the constrained asset is experiencing an overload condition, that device can throttle the customer's load without needing sort of a controlling signal from a centralized data management system. I understand that PG&E is also developing a program like this that would do something similar, but using AMI, using the next generation of advanced metering infrastructure to develop a local load management envelope for premises. And then, as you head to the right, centralized management, that would be frequent or continuous communications between the customer's load control management systems or other sort of load throttling systems and the utility's central databases. Next slide, please. Compliance mechanism. How will the utility enforce the customer's adherence to the load limit? In general, the further to the right you go, the more asset headroom or operational flexibility utility will need to be able to accommodate the mechanism. Least complex is if the customer hits their cap, that you trip them off. This option will frequently not be palatable to customers, but it's theoretically possible. Next step to the right would be a hardware or software configuration of the customer's LCMS, like the Southern California Edison LCMS pilot I mentioned earlier. That doesn't necessarily disconnect the customer at exceedance, but is configured to prevent that customer from exceeding in the first place. And then as you head to the right, in terms of complexity, financial mechanisms. These could be things like customers' contract demand goes up for the remainder of their contract if they exceed their load a certain number of times. Or it could use a standby rate structure to assess a penalty for non-performance, that sort of thing. We sort of have a joke at EDF that every problem seemed to devolve to standby rates. If you look at it hard enough, that going to the right really invites key question number 4, right? How much should the penalty be? Or to ask it another way, what's the right standby rate structure by which to compensate or penalize customers who participate in long-term flexible service connections? Elizabeth also mentioned this in her presentation. I will say, I'm not going to try to answer that here. It's really hard and complex. But a takeaway is that we don't think you need to answer that question right now to set up flexible service connections. Yes, customers on flexible service connections probably cost something different to serve than customers not taking advantage of those options. That may not work for the long term, right? But some amount of intra-class rate cost shifting is sort of endemic to every rate class. And frequently it'll be worth it to customers, as Elizabeth mentioned, to get on sooner, right? And pay the same rate, even though in the long term they may actually incur less costs than the class average on the utility to serve. That said, we are going to need to figure out standby rates to make permanent flexible service connections a workable reality. Next slide, please. So this is just I'm not going to read through this table. This is a chart pulled from the white paper that articulates sort of a few different types of theoretical flexible service connection regimes you could land at based on different suitability criteria. Next slide, please. So at base, though, before getting to any of the sort of more sophisticated dynamic models, is the lower tech trust and what I'm calling the trust and verify model. We're citing to California, but those are EDF's words, not the California Commission's, where a customer commits to a load limit, the utility verifies their adherence to that limit using meter data, and the customer manage their own load controls. the result is basically customers agree to stay under a limit, and as a result, the utility is able to energize them sooner. This is a low tech, really a process-based approach. It's one that as Elizabeth has mentioned, PG&E and Southern California Edison have been implementing already. We at EDF suspect that many utilities are sort of informally applying this approach already. Many may not even have tariffs to do it, which can be fine. You don't necessarily need a tariff to do this. It's a matter of establishing trust between the customer and the utility, and there are models and sort of examples of where that has been done. Next slide, please. I suppose at this point between me and Elizabeth, we've basically summarized the California example. If to the extent you're looking for a record to illustrate the sort of trust and verify in practice, the energization's timeline proceeding at the California Commission's docket has developed a robust record and has earned the Commission's stamp of approval or acceptance of this load limit letter process. Next slide, please. So bottom line, wherever utility is on their journey, at least the low tech option of a flexible service connection will often be practicable for that utility as a starting point. Now, I think takeaways from this, is thinking about is this, as utilities are starting, a takeaway is that they should be thinking about leveraging how to leverage existing and in the pipeline efforts to enable this sort of thing. Like frequently it can be process, but often they can use some of the IT systems that they may already be planning to build, for example, for managing injectable resources generation to support the development of flexible service connections. I noted a couple of next frontier items down here at the bottom. Integrating, like to really unlock the value of FSCs, you need to understand how to compensate the customers, right, for the value they're providing the grid, as mentioned earlier. And to really get that value, you need to figure out how they should be incorporated into grid planning. How can planners rely on and plan around application of FSCs? So lots of additional work to do there, right? But we have a starting point sort of that's already been deployed today. With that, I think my last slide is just a thank you. My email is there. I will drop into the chat while we're speaking a link to that white paper I mentioned. And thank you very much for your time. I look forward to questions.
Mike, thank you so much. That was terrific. And again, if you can hold and wait for some questions that I expect we will have for you. Appreciate the very helpful presentation. And next up, we have our fabulous RMI team. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben and Gerard. I think, Ben, you may be up first.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. I'll just speak briefly for a minute or two to introduce some of our work on this topic and then hand it over for some of the details to Gerard, who really deserves the credit for the interesting analysis that he'll be stepping through. So as Commissioner Rubin mentioned at the top, my name is Ben Shapiro. I am a principal helping to lead the transportation program here at RMI. And among the various topics that we have been focused on in the last few years, flexible service connection has certainly been one that has been increasingly taking up our headspace because we think it's a really promising opportunity. I think that Elizabeth and Mike have just stepped through a lot of the details in a really helpful way. And what I hope we can do here is to provide a little bit of a different perspective. If you can go to the next slide, please. Really centering the perspective of fleets here and how this might look from some of the truck operators on their side as one of the key opportunity areas. As Elizabeth mentioned, this is not limited only to electric vehicles, this flexible service connection concept, but we do think it's an important use case that will be one of the earlier applications to take advantage of this pathway if we can all make it work for those customers. So just to tee things up here, as I think most on this group will be aware, finding access to charging infrastructure continues to be a pretty significant barrier for fleets to electrify. The costs are high and the timelines are long. making a lot of fleets who may not be very familiar with electric vehicles and the various considerations that go with them very interested in this route. And for that reason, we think that flexible service connections hold a lot of promise to speed up that timeline and to bring down the costs, whether that's as Elizabeth was speaking to, more of a temporary fashion with bridge to wires, or longer term, something that could actually be a more permanent solution for those fleets and for the grid, although recognize, as she had mentioned, that that may be further out into the future. And so I'll pass it over to Gerard here in just a moment, but I think that the perspective we're hoping to bring here is to understand better from the fleets interfacing with the utilities how much of an impact these flexible service connections can have on their operations and also on the distribution system, with an analysis that Gerard has been leading over the last few months. There will also be, not to be the only of the three of us to not mention a white paper, there will be a white paper forthcoming, have no fear, I believe towards the end of next month. So stay tuned. We will be sure to circulate that. And with that, I think I will pass it over to Gerard. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide, please. Now, in this analysis, we've explored the untapped capacity that is on the table that could be used by fleets. Now, we focus this on fleets in particular rather than light-duty vehicles, as these heavy-duty fleets have large intermittent loads. They're very sensitive to economics. That changes in fuel price can significantly change their decision to adopt a vehicle. And the timelines over which they often make their decisions and buy vehicles aren't really compatible with the long interconnection times that are often triggered by site upgrades. Additionally, many fleets already manage their charging today in response to TOU limits, so that they have the flexible potential to shift their load. Now, what this plot here shows is the gap in capacity that is between kind of like a normal planning limit and what is available on a capacity. And how much we are showing through our analysis could be used to charge fleet vehicles by just shifting load by a few hours. And to estimate this potential, we built an optimization model that takes in feeder level data and telematic data from fleet vehicles to estimate kind of what are the load curves from charging for fleet vehicles and what is their ability to kind of shift when they are charging. Next slide, please. Now, a key upfront finding from this is that over half of all vehicles in California today require less than half of their time at domicile to charge at a power of 75 kilowatts. Many vehicles use higher power charging, and some of them need even less than that. There was a study out last week by Amp Control, a managed charging provider, that found that on average, the fleets that they manage the charging for return to depot and plug in with around 40% of their battery life remaining, and that the majority of charges for these Class A vehicles was just a kind of a top-up charge, showing that there is a lot of potential for that charging to be managed in response to load limits and flexible service connections. Now, we applied this kind of behavior, or however the time at domicile these vehicles have on average, and then applied that to this feeder level data that we got for PG&E and for National Grid. Next slide, please. Now, to talk you through the approach, first we synthesized some load curves. Now, these, as I mentioned, were based on geotab telematic data. We kind of produced a base unmanaged load curve of a vehicle plugging in when they return to depot. We also then, using the duty cycles of those vehicles and when they are at the depot, also synthesized potential load curves for like maximally managed load. So that could be a slow load curve or a overnight load curve. And by slow load curve, I mean that is charging at the minimum viable power for them to receive a full charge over the time that they're at the depot. We then defined a flexibility window over which their truck charging behavior would be modified by our model in response to load curtailment from a feeder being constrained. As a default, we set that at 1 megawatt, and then we looked at varying numbers of hours that the load would be shifted by. To define a flexibility window in this analysis a bit more clearly, if a load is hitting the peak of the feeder during 1 hour only, between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m., then a flexibility window of 2 hours in this analysis is that shifting 1 hour forward or back from that. And essentially, by applying this concept across kind of the 2,000 feeders in PG&E and applying these load curves for individual trucks, we then scaled up those load curves to see, okay, if these vehicles shift their charging by kind of an hour, then on this feeder, they can get around 20 extra trucks charged by just shifting for 1 month a year. Or it could be, if they could shift by 3 hours, it could be even more. Now, what this initial plot shows on the right is the share of feeders across PG&E that could charge an additional 10 hours, sorry, an additional 10 trucks from a small shift in the hours over which they are charging their vehicle. Now, we looked at both kind of regional haul trucks and urban haul trucks. Now, the regional ones are going around 300 miles a day. They are charging several hundred kilowatt hours a day of their battery, and they're charging at around 150 kilowatt hours peak per vehicle. And we basically found that with just 3 hours of shifting over which their load is, the charge is drawing its peak capacity from the grid, 80% of feeders in PG&E territory could charge an additional 10 trucks. Now, this load scenario that we were using for PG&E feeders was a very conservative, highest possible kind of historical load day to show that this is possible. And when looking at kind of a more moderate scenario, the potential is even greater for these vehicles to charge additional vehicles than would be available to be charged under conventional load limits and interconnections. Next slide, please. Now, this plot summarizes one of the key benefits we found in this analysis. To demonstrate this to both fleets and to utilities, that fleets have the ability to shift, and that has the ability to translate into large amounts of load shifted on utility feeders. So there are benefits on both sides for the fleets to save money and for the utilities to get better utilization of their assets and curtail grid peaks. As the load flexibility by fleets expands, the benefits expand to more feeders, but also it expands the scale of the benefits. By that I mean the median incremental benefit is increasing as the flexibility window increases. For example, as it increases from just 2 hours to 6 hours, that could be as simple as moving from charging between, say, 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. at the end of the shift and shifting that to 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. onwards. That is increasing the benefit by around 3 additional trucks to around 22 additional trucks being able to be charged on that feeder. And these are incremental benefits above the baseline of what would be allowed to be charged on those feeders under conventional load limits. Now, we scaled this up over feeders, taking some conservative assumptions, and this would basically enable 25,000 to 75,000 additional heavy-duty trucks to charge on existing feeders, no upgrades, and that is more electric trucks than were sold in all of California last year, and it's only slightly less than the number that are on the road in California across all weight classes for the commercial fleet sector. And some feeders have significantly more potential than others. Some feeders have very narrow but prominent peaks. So they have a very sharp peak at around 5 p.m., 6 p.m. And if you can just shift beyond that, you gain so much additional capacity for fleets to charge. So this is an approach that needs to be focused in and looking at where the feeders have the greatest potential and where the duty cycles of fleets located near those feeders have the maximum potential to shift. As some operations are more flexible than others, and this is why speaking to fleets early in the design of these types of programs, if you're targeting them, is a very important thing to do. Next slide, please. Now, this is some findings from applying alternate load curves to our analysis. Now, the unmanaged scenario is the base scenario we use. That is just charging when you plug in and looking at what is the flexibility benefit from just shifting that by a few hours. And then this is comparing that to an overnight approach and a slow approach. Now, this just shows how with overnight charging, if you just tweak it ever so slightly more and have it charging from even later in the evening and not having any kind of tail end of the evening peak in your charging, you get a lot of benefit very quickly for additional trucks that you can charge. We also found that slow charging has a lot of potential as well, but it is much more challenging for fleets to kind of implement operationally. Fleets are often pretty conservative in wanting their vehicles fueled and ready to go sooner. So minimizing this as much as possible is better for the fleets. And we actually have also done this analysis for National Grid, and that will be in our white paper. And we found that they actually have a little less benefits from overnight charging, getting slightly less benefits from flexible service connections compared to PG&E due to higher nighttime loads than in PG&E territory. Next slide, please. Now, this is a heat map showing the peak hour for which flexibility is required by trucks charging on a feeder in our analysis. So that is, what are the most high levels of constrained grid on a feeder during the year for that specific feeder that are requiring things to shift. Now, in National Grid, those hours are pretty uniform. It's a pretty narrow peak over which the peak is normally starting on each feeder. It's around kind of 4 p.m., 5 p.m. However, they also have a split season peak where some feeders are actually peaking in the winter months. Whereas for PG&E, less feeders are peaking in the winter months, but a large volume of them have pretty variable and wide peaks over the afternoon. Next slide, please. To summarize, there are some really big opportunities for flexible service connections to provide benefits to fleets, and fleets have the ability to shift their load based on their time at domicile today and how they are currently managing charging to save fuel costs. Now, using data is a really promising way to kind of identify where fleets have that potential the most and which feeders have the greatest potential. Looking at kind of where there are clusters of fleets is a good way to approach this as well. An open question here as well is, as was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, current implementations are only allowing one flexible customer per feeder. Now, working with kind of fleets to address how they can share flexibility between multiple customers is definitely an opportunity moving forward from this. Most of all, do not forget to speak to the fleets and understand their appetite for modest operational changes. Now, there are several enablers in this space that have already been mentioned. Like I mentioned earlier, people like AMP Control. There are other companies out there as well who are helping fleets manage their charging today. Now, these are companies that will very rapidly respond to any incentive to enact a flexible service connection in collaboration with the fleet. Now, putting all of this together, you can really have a strong potential for asset utilization for utility companies, time saving for fleets, and financial savings for fleets, and potentially even financial savings for the utility as well, through applying these approaches. And that is all I have. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben and Gerard. Very, very interesting analysis. Appreciate it. And thanks to all for the white papers. Always helpful to walk away with a document. So I think if we can take down the slides and bring all of our speakers back, I welcome people to raise their Zoom hands if you have a question. And while people are deciding whether they do, I'm going to start us off. And in fact, I'm going to start with Elizabeth. So I really appreciated your recommendation slide. And one of your recommendations for commissions was to support utility research and development and R&D needs. I am curious, there's a lot of research out there. If there's something that you specifically can recommend that we should be encouraging utilities to be doing. And I'll also just note that I think all of us across the country are really worried about affordability and trying to balance, where is the best place when we are spending ratepayer dollars or authorizing that spend, how to sort of balance that with what's really going to be beneficial from the R&D side. So I just hope you can talk through a little bit more specifically what you're thinking there, and if you can give us some more targeted recommendations, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this recommendation really came from our utility members, right, who are, I think, looking at some of the programs on flexible service connections that are offered by PG&E and SCE and saying, gosh, it would take a lot for us to get to the point where we could do something like that. And that's less so on sort of like the program design, all the really good choice points that Mike laid out. I mean, I think sort of what the offer to the customer ends up looking like, I think we've got a lot of information about that. But then how does that actually get implemented on the back end? How do you communicate with the customer? How do you integrate the assumptions into your grid planning? How do you set up, that trust but verify system that Mike spoke of, and ensure that the customer is adhering to those load limits? How do you, do the forecasting and things like that to anticipate what those load limits should be? So I think those are the pieces that our utility members sort of were trying to wrap their heads around. And so I think there's a lot that we can port over from other service territories in terms of design. And we say this all the time about pilots and things like that. We don't want to see pilots, implemented in every single service territory. That's, when it comes to sort of the design of the thing, we can learn across service territory boundaries and across state boundaries. But when it comes to implementation and how does it actually operationally work within the utility, that's where I think we can't expect utilities to go from 0 to 60. We have to sort of have that implementation learning curve. And so I think that's where the R&D funding for these types of activities really has enabled the utilities who are doing it to build those skill sets over time. So that's the type of thing that we're recommending there.
That's great. Very helpful. Thank you. Before I ask further questions, Commissioner Paratic.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, I had a question for Michael. I really liked the way that you framed the complexity scale of the where to land in terms of various parts of complexity of these types of tariffs or structures for flexible interconnection. How should a utility think about deciding where to land on that scale? Like, how do you choose where that right point is? Like, is it to the left, right, or middle? And how can you talk a little bit about now how to actually implement that?
Sure. Well, and I thank you for the question. I'll give you my sort of opinion, which is that utilities should probably land, at least initially, at where they can implement readily with limited additional costs. Right. I think as I attempted to say in the final slide, but sort of flubbed, it's more important to start somewhere, right, than to try to go out and buy a whole new system just for the sake of building flexible service connections. Because there's some flexible service connection regime that can probably fit for whatever level of technical sophistication the utility is at. So for all that, at EDF, we would love to see utilities with really sophisticated DERM systems, right, that can do lots of dynamic load management. The incremental value of that, just for at least for load interconnections, we doubt that the benefits will justify the cost just for that use case. So we would suggest that utilities start with where are we currently at, right, and what do we have in the pipeline that can be applied either as is or with minor modifications to enable flexible service connections. Start with that, right? And then gain experience with that, see how it works with their customers, right? See what needs are not being met, and then they'll be able to refine from there.
Elizabeth, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, if I could just jump in because I think, ATE, as I mentioned, also represents customers in all of this, right? And we have heard from our members who are customers in these programs where they say, we do not want to be part of PG&E's Flex Connect pilot, for example. We do not want to invest in that much equipment on our side of the meter for a temporary solution. And the sort of more granular load profiles that we would get don't actually give us meaningfully more operational flexibility. We want to be on the static flexible service connection. That's all we will ever want or need. And so I think that as we look at these different solutions, I don't think we should presume that the more technically complex or sophisticated solution is necessarily better for every use case.
Fair point. Thanks for that reminder. Great. I want to ask the RMI team. So Ben and Gerard, I think this is a really interesting analysis. And at the end, Gerard, you had mentioned that a lot of this sort of study was thinking about one fleet in particular that has a flexible service connection, and there's the opportunity for multiple fleets to be involved. How does the conversation happen between multiple fleet managers? What's the role of the utility? I'm trying to understand operationally, how would that happen? Who's leading the conversation, and how does that get managed?
Yeah, this is a very early stage piece we're thinking about right now. But I think essentially you do need a kind of a role of the utility to kind of set what is the limit for this specific group of organizations that want this connection. And then between them, you kind of need to establish potentially even if it's dynamically managed, you kind of need static limits for the individual fleets. It does get a lot more complicated as there is more than one fleet involved. And in writing this report and white paper, we spoke to fleets and we spoke to charging providers. And to echo what Elizabeth just said, we found that charging providers in particular, they want a static connection because they're selling capacity at the end of the day. Fleets have that additional layer of flexibility, especially some more sophisticated ones which have the available DERs on site. So I think if you're getting to the point where multiple fleets are on the same feeder, sharing flexibility, you're probably getting into an even more complex environment where some of those fleets have sophistication, may even have DERs as well.
Thanks for that. Great. I have one last question. Feel free, others, if you want to raise your hand, please don't be shy. So this question is for Mike. Your trust and verify model, you talked about, exceedances and they're handled through follow-up and remediation. Could you kind of drill down on what is the realistic ways that utilities handle these exceedances? How do those conversations go? How does this sort of play out in a realistic realm?
That's an excellent question that I'm not in a great position to answer. In fact, from the customer perspective, I would invite Gerard and Ben, if you've had or Elizabeth, actually, if you've had engagements with customers who are on load limit letters in California, if you're able to speak to that.
I'm not. I think if I remember within the regulatory record, PG&E, I mean, it's literally a pick up the phone and talk to the customer kind of solution, which I think in some of their comments they provided, they indicated was working just fine because it's just sort of a reminder structure. But they also acknowledged that it's a manual process that doesn't scale very well and also continues to contain some risk.
And so, in terms of Commissioner, how frequently they're picking up the phone and calling customers and how our customers responding to that, that's an excellent question for the utilities. I'm afraid I don't know. Yeah.
Appreciate the answer. Yeah, and I didn't mean to stump the speakers there at all. Excellent. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So with that, I want to thank you all so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, Mike, Ben, and Gerard, so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise. We really appreciate it. I know there are links that were put in the chat, so thank you for that. And at this point, we will ask you to step off so we can move into our discussion portion of the meeting. But thank you so much for joining the EV State Working Group.
Thank you.